All right. Say hello to Amelia.
Hello, Amelia.
Today, we're going to start with baptism, or we're going to work baptism. But before we do that, we're going to stand as best we can. Jalen broke his leg. He's not standing. And we are going to say the Nicene Creed. Ready? I saw you practicing it in church today. Good dude. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, all that is seen and unseen. We believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, eternally begotten of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, one with the Father. Through him all things were made. For us and for our salvation, he came down from heaven. By the power of the Holy Spirit, he became incarnate from the Virgin Mary and was made man. For our sake he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered death and was buried. On the third day he rose again in accordance with the Scriptures. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. We believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord giver of life, who proceeds from the Father and the Son. The Father and the Son, she is worshipped and glorified. She has spoken through the prophets. We believe in one holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. We acknowledge one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. We look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Amen. Well done. Well done. And of course, Amelia was saying it along with us in spirit. That's good. So, summary of the law. Who can do me the summary of the law? Can everybody do me the summary of the law?
Yes.
Okay. Braden, summary of the law.
Of God with our soul, mind, strength.
Okay. Upon these two.
Yeah, I thought I didn't memorize. You want the end of upon?
I just wanted you to know it. You don't have to do that. You know, it's upon these two depend all the law and the prophets, or there are no two. There is no longer in these. Take your pick. There are two different gospels, have two different versions. It's okay. But it is nice to know that's it. And it's also nice to know the context. Somebody came up to Jesus and said, "What do I got to do to live?" And Jesus said, "You tell me. What's the law? What's the law say?" All right. How are you guys doing with the 23rd Psalm?
I got like the
Go get prayer books?
I got the first two some parts. I don't know.
I got
it's like all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Go get prayer books.
I've been quizzing for Braden, so
He's got it.
he's got it.
Oh, good. I got the Lord is my.
Shepherd.
Oh, that, yeah. I got that part.
I think everyone does.
I better have one too, huh? He's got it memorized. He doesn't need it.
Oh,
It's all right. I can hold it.
oh, that was fun.
Are we breaking things?
No, it was just like
It's like,
stuck
Oh.
onto the table. I'm like, what happened?
They got stuck to the table?
Yeah.
Good. All right. So you remember the page?
476.
Good deal. That was a good brownie.
Okay.
All right. If you don't need it, you can set it down if you think you've got it, but use it as a resource. This is the hardest one, I think, of the four. So, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
I shall fear no evil.
For
rod and thy staff. Oops. For thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff that comfort me. Sorry, I messed up. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Good. You guys are doing better than I am. So, yay.
I got half.
Hmm?
I got half of it, so.
Good. That's progress. Next, the Ten Commandments. I know you guys know them all. So, Bill, what's number 1?
There shall be no other God but me.
Good. You shall have no other God but me. Excellent. How about number 2? Let's do out of order. Grace.
I always get 2 and 3 mixed up. You shall not make any name of yourself.
You shall not make an
Idol.
idol. Okay. Actually, that would be number 3, isn't it? No, that's number 2.
It's 2.
Number 3.
You shall not invoke with malice the name of the Lord.
Good. Number 4. Jalen.
Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy.
Good. Number 5. Braden.
Honor thy mother and father.
Good. Good. Number 6. Bill.
You shall not murder.
Number 7. Jalen.
You shall not commit adultery. Question mark?
Adultery? No, you really shall not.
More of a statement.
number
Question
7. Andy.
Thou shalt not steal.
Number 8. Grace.
I completely forgot this one. You shall not covet your neighbor's goods. Is that
Something
10?
before that.
False witness?
False witness.
I thought that was 9.
Wait, what did I miss?
You missed.
I
You asked
did.
her for 8, right?
Yeah. I
8
missed.
is.
Steal.
I thought
You
we
shall
already
not
did steal.
I did adultery, murder.
Adultery.
Oh, I thought somebody did steal.
You didn't steal.
You did. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. So I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So after stealing is
Fair.
bearing false
False
witness.
witness,
Right.
yeah.
We're gonna do this again, guys. And
Okay.
number 10. And who hasn't done a second one? Is Bill? Do number 10.
You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor.
Good. Okay. Who can do all 10 for me? Good, Braden. Thanks. I appreciate your volunteering.
And you shall not worship any other god than me. Do not make yourself any idol. You shall not invoke the Lord's name in malice. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor thy father and mother. Shall not murder. Shall not commit adultery. Shall not steal. Shall not bear false witness. Shall not covet your neighbor's belongings.
Good. Good job. All right. We've done all 4 things, right?
Mhm.
Have a seat. Bill, will you do me before? Will you shut that door? Don't get rid of the books. You're going to need the books. You're going to need the books. Because we are going to be studying and taking apart the baptismal covenant in a little while. But before we do, let's go back to last week for a minute and remember what we talked about sacraments. What is a sacrament? Do you need something, Jalen?
I was just gonna grab a chair.
A different chair?
Just to put my leg up.
Okay.
We can grab that.
Here.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Here. Go sit down. I got it.
Alright, thank you.
Like no hands, unless you're gonna levitate it over.
I'm gonna figure it out. Sorry.
Don't break your leg and don't break anybody else.
Jalen's got a broken leg and Grace just lost an eye.
Yep.
Not doing
Right
well.
through the back.
I joke about. I told you how it's like. I used to get phone calls from the school and I just say, who is it and what's broken. One day they call me up and say, come and pick up your kid. He's broken. And it's like, what? He gets a concussion running cross country.
Low branch?
He did run headfirst into a tree.
Full tree.
Into a tree, headfirst.
Oh. Managed to run into a tree. Trying to go around it.
The number of times we had broken bones, torn ligaments, concussions, it's just... Anyway, that has nothing to do with baptism, just so you know. Baptism, however, is one of the sacraments. And you remember what we said about sacraments. What is a sacrament? What's the one word I'm looking for?
Sign?
Yes, it is. Sign. Remember, it's a sign, right? A sign of
Grace.
grace. Right. Every single sacrament is a sign of grace. And there are a lot of things, the church teaches, there are a lot of things that can be sacramental that aren't sort of the official sacraments, right? But the two biggest sacraments are what?
Holy Eucharist and
Communion?
Holy Baptism.
Yep, Eucharist and baptism, exactly. They're the ones that Jesus said to the disciples, do this. The other things Jesus never commanded anybody to do, but they seem helpful, and they do seem to be signs of grace. Grace, which is sort of God acting in our lives and us becoming aware of it in a positive way. So that's it. Now, every single sign has a physical manifestation, has some physical form or some form that you can perceive, whether it's through touch or taste or sound. The church, do you know the word tactile? Touch something, you can feel it. The church is really tactile. It's all about listening and feeling and tasting. You know, everything we do, you can either feel, hear, or taste. All the sacraments are like that. They engage the senses. That's just how that is. Because a sign is something that you can feel or touch or taste or something like that. That's what it is. So every one of them has an outward form. Now that we know that, what is the outward form of baptism? What are the physical parts of baptism? Jalen.
Touch.
Touch
Like,
with
feel it with water and the priest who's baptizing you.
number one, water. You can't have a Christian baptism without water. Water is the sign, as it were. It's the thing that we use for it. And you're right. I mean, there has to be somebody who puts the water on you or who throws you in the water. You can put people in the water. You're not supposed to throw people in the water. You dip them in the water. No, that,
Yes, don't throw your babies in the water.
yeah, don't do that. CPS will be after you. The cops will get you. But water. And we're actually going to talk about that whole throwing people in the water in a minute, at a more serious level. Water. Do you guys remember, do you remember, first of all, if you remember when you yourselves were baptized, I'll be amazed, but let me know if you remember when you yourselves were baptized.
No.
All right. Have you ever seen anybody else get baptized that you remember? What? I know you would, yeah. What happened? What? I mean, just physically, step one, step two, step three. What happened? What did they do? People walked into the church and.
They said,
Hmm?
yeah, they said a prayer, I think.
Yeah. Well, now was this at a Catholic church or an Episcopal church?
I have no clue.
Oh, okay.
I was Catholic.
Well, in our church, it's always going to be on a regular Sunday.
Okay.
That's how we do it. It'll be right in the middle of the service. And in fact, when you get confirmed, there will be a baptism as well. Frankie Regalis is going to get baptized that day.
Yeah.
So that'll be cool. Right? The very first thing you do, other than there is an examination and a covenant that is said, promises that are made back and forth. Very similar to what you'll be saying, by the way. At any rate, once that's done, the actual baptism itself is where the priest, and it does not have to be a priest. With baptism, it doesn't have to be a priest. You could baptize somebody.
Really?
Yeah.
Can I go baptize my friend today?
Well, I mean, if your friend says sure, then if they don't want to, then I wouldn't do it.
Okay.
Don't baptize people who don't want to be baptized. That's
Drop a bucket of water on them. Bam.
Yeah, the ice challenge is not.
Yeah.
That's not baptism. not only that, but it also has to be, we talk about the spirit of the law as opposed to the technicalities. I mean, we're going to talk about some of the technicalities, but the spirit of the law is desire. You want this. That's the whole point of baptism. You remember we were talking about a sacrament, an analogy of that would be a kiss. When it comes to baptism, if you've ever had a boyfriend or a girlfriend and you've ever kissed them, or a wife, that works too, there's always a first kiss. And that is the moment where everything changes. And again, it's not magic, but it can feel like it. And it changes the relationship. It just does. So the moment here, rather than an actual kiss, we use water. In our church, we pour water on top of people. In some churches, they dip the people in water. It doesn't really matter how you do it. But that's the sign of it. Now, why? Why is that the sign of baptism?
Washing your sins.
Washing your sins? Tell you what we're going to do. Let's just take a moment and look at water for a second. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume you know a couple of Bible stories. So, think of a Bible story that has water in it. Any amount of water. Okay, Jalen, and then Grace. Moses, what did he do?
When he splits water and then lets it go through.
See, there are a lot of stories with Moses and water, so that's one of the good ones where he parts the Red Sea. Grace, you had your hand up?
Ark?
Noah's Ark, of course, duh. Oh, that'll be good enough. Braden, did you have your hand up? No. Bill, can you think of a water story?
No.
Think of a water story with Jesus.
Water into wine.
Turning water into wine. You go to a party, they run out of wine, Jesus takes care of it. Braden.
Doesn't he walk on water?
Walking on water. Exactly. Got any others?
John the Baptist?
John the Baptist, what's he doing?
Baptizing.
Baptizing, yeah. Although, what he was doing and what we're doing is different. But that's okay. Sorry. That's a T. Think of it in something else. You can do Moses, you can do Noah, you can do Jesus. Jalen?
Adam and Eve.
What'd they do?
I mean, the fruit needed water to.
Well, I'll tell you though, if you go a little before they were actually made, God, the Spirit of God, hovered over the waters
Creation?
in creation. Creation itself involved water. Now, with Moses, Moses. With Moses, before the parting of the Red Sea, Moses is one who had grew up in Egypt, even though he was an Israelite. He grew up in the royal family, the Egyptian family, while the Israelites were in slavery, right? And then he runs away, but God calls him through a burning bush and says, "Go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go." You know that story, right? So Moses goes there and he tells Pharaoh, "Let the Hebrew people go." And Pharaoh says, "No." And Moses goes to God and says, he won't let him go. And God says, "Do this." And over several different times, Moses he sends a plague of frogs. He sends a plague of locusts that eat all their plants. He finally turns the Nile River into blood, which is kind of gross. That freaks them out. So that's one of the plagues that Moses brought to Egypt. And then after the Red Sea, when they're wandering around in the wilderness for a long time, they complained a lot. They just complained an awful lot to Moses, and he just kept getting tired of this. And one time they were complaining that they didn't have any water. They ran out of water, they had no water, they were afraid they were all going to die. Moses goes to God and says, what am I going to do? And God says, there's a rock over there, take your staff, your walking stick, go hit it. And he does, and water pours out of the rock. That's another one of his stories. With Jesus, he turns water into wine, he gets baptized by the Baptist, he walks on water. There's another time when he's out in a boat with the disciples and a storm hits up.
Calms the water.
What happens? He
Calms it.
calms the whole storm. Let's see if there's another Old Testament guy you can think of. Have you ever heard of a guy named Jonah? That's a Bible story, right? What happened in Jonah?
The whale? Did he get eaten by a whale?
Why?
He's running away.
The whale was hungry. Yeah. No. Why? What's the backstory here? What happened?
Jonah didn't want to go where the Lord was asking him to go.
Mm-hmm.
Went the other way. Boat sunk. Fell off the boat.
Jonah wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. He was a prophet, and God said to Jonah one day, he says, I want you to go to this town called Nineveh. And I want you to go tell the people of Nineveh, you got to shape up, you got to quit sinning, or I'm going to destroy the whole town. Here's the problem. Jonah hated Nineveh. And so he goes through this little mental calculation. He says, you know what? If I don't go to Nineveh and tell them to repent, to stop up, to shape up, they won't know. And so they won't behave. They won't shape up. And then God will destroy them. Why would I go warn them when I want them to get destroyed by God? So, but he also knew that God ordered him to do it. So he figured, I know what I'll do. I'll run away from God. Don't try it. So he hops on a boat going the opposite direction, and a giant storm hits. And in those days, sailors believed that if they're in the middle of a storm, that's because somebody has made the gods angry. So their practice was to find the guilty party and throw them overboard. And so they started drawing lots to figure out who the guilty party was, and it fell on Jonah. And they said, Jonah, but they were scared of that because they knew he was a prophet, right? And so they said, Jonah, it's like, don't tell us it's not you. And he says, yeah, it's me, might as well throw me overboard. And so they throw him overboard, and the storm stops. But Jonah, of course, that doesn't help him. He's sinking. A great fish, maybe a whale, we don't know, swallows him, and he spends 3 days in the belly of this great fish or this whale. All the time he is thinking about his life choices and pondering if there might have been a better way to go. And as he's thinking about this, after 3 days, the giant fish or the whale comes up to shore and pukes him out, just throws him up. And he lands up on the beach, and then God says, Jonah, let's try this again. At which point Jonah says, I think I'll go to Nineveh. And so he does. He goes to Nineveh and he tells them the story. He tells them to behave, and much to his very bitter disappointment, the people of Nineveh say, oh, we didn't know. We'd better change. And so they don't get destroyed. And the whole story ends with Jonah being mad at God because God didn't kill a lot of people. Good guy, Jonah. Anyway, the water plays a big role there, doesn't it? So we're going to put Jonah here too. Now, if you looked at some of these things. And we should mention that when Jesus calms the storm, he's on the Sea of Galilee, which is a big lake. It's just a lake, right? But in that part of the country, actually in most big lakes, storms can come pretty quickly and pretty harsh. I grew up not far from the Great Lakes, and when a storm hits on Lake Michigan, you do not want to be on that water. The more boats and more people are killed on that lake probably than in the oceans. Just it's these storms come hard and heavy. So they had every reason to be afraid of that storm. It's not a joking matter for them. So if you look at all these things, think about the Red Sea. And do you know what happened in the story of the Red Sea? What happened? Jalen, tell me.
They were being chased
By?
by
Well, who did they escape from?
the Egyptians.
Yeah.
And they were being chased, and then Moses parted the seas, so the Israelites could go through, and then after they went through, then he closed it behind him, and then all the Egyptians got like swept up by the water.
And basically
Died.
killed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in that story, what would the water represent, do you think?
Death.
Death
And
for the
life,
Egyptians.
and life.
And life for,
Moses.
yeah, and his gang. Good. How about the story of Noah? What would water represent there?
Death and life.
Yeah, depending on which side of the boat
Yeah.
you are. It's like, I gotta wonder. They're sitting on the boat. What would would you be thinking if all the people there saying, "I got a ticket. I got a ticket." No, too late. What would you? If you're on the boat, you're saved through the water, right? If you're off the boat, that's destruction and death. And really, even if you're on the boat, everything you knew before is gone. There's a lot of destructive power there. How about walking on water? What would the water represent there? No idea? We'll go back to that one later on. Remember when I was talking about Moses and the water from the rock? Remember that? What would the water from the rock represent?
Life.
Life. Okay, good. So I'm noticing a theme here. How about the calming the storm? What would that water represent?
It was destructive, and then it's no longer destructive.
Yeah. How about, here's another story. Remember when Jesus was just calling his disciples? Where does he call Peter and Andrew from? And James and John, actually.
On water? When they were fishing, right?
They were fishermen, right?
Yeah.
Do you remember how he calls them?
Make them fishers of men.
Yeah, and you know what the story is. They've been out fishing all night, right? And how much did they catch?
Nothing.
Nothing. But then he goes and he says, let's go put out for a little bit. You know, and there are several stories of this also. One at the very beginning of his ministry when he's calling them, and one after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, when he does the same thing. So this happens a couple of times. And he says, go put out the fish. And they're like, come on. We already did this. We tried this. It didn't work. He says, just put the nets out. And all of a sudden, hundreds of fish jump into their nets, practically saying, we were just waiting for you. So for them, if not life for the fish, but livelihood for the people, the water represents. So a lot of life for them. So right now, I mean, Jesus turning water into wine, probably not death. And not exactly life either. But maybe
Life of the party.
life is a party. You're not far off. And here's two things about that. One is, yeah, absolutely, celebration. We'll call it celebration and joy, right? It's much more fun when you've got that extra something there going on. The other part of it, though, is compassion. Because what do you know? Do you know why he turned water into wine?
Because they ran out of wine.
Who ran out of wine?
The hosts.
Of
The wedding.
Party.
what
Wedding.
party was it?
A wedding?
A wedding. The reason that little detail is important is because, I mean, we make a big deal and we blow a lot of money on weddings here. Nothing like there. There, they put everything into it. Everybody goes. You don't just put out an invitation list. Everybody, the whole town, everyone's coming. It is a huge deal. And your future, the way people look at you in the future, depends on how good a show you put on, as it were. To run out of wine that early on in a wedding is like disaster, especially if you're the guy responsible for providing the wine, which a guy was named who was called a steward. He screwed up. He didn't do it right. He miscalculated, and he was in hot water. So other folks would say, well, too bad. And Mary, Jesus' mother, said, do something. And he says, mind your own business. Don't make. He literally said the equivalent of mind your own business. But then he turns around and he says, okay, go fill these jugs with water. Take them to the steward. Takes them to the steward, and they're the best wine ever, right? There's an element of mercy or compassion here that is super important. I'm going to skip John the Baptist for now. Okay, the walking on water. We didn't really discuss that, did we? What would that symbolize? Almost out of paper.
Jesus' power.
Power.
His miracle. He's walking on water where other men would have fallen and drown.
And did you know that somebody else walked on water too?
No.
Anybody? Any idea who else walked on water?
Moses.
No, in the same
Oh.
story. In the same story.
Like,
Was it one of his
Peter
disciples?
Peter out of the boat.
Peter. Yeah, because Peter is the guy who always talks before he thinks. I mean, he just does. He's the guy. He's the oldest, and so they sort of looked to him to be the spokesman to start off with. But he just talks. He says whatever's on his mind without any filter, And so Peter says, "Wow, who are you?" And Jesus says, "Don't worry, I'm not a ghost. It's just me." And Peter is the one who says, "Yeah, if it's you, then tell me to come out and walk out to you." And it's like a dare. And Jesus says, "Come on out, the water's fine." And Peter does. And I don't know if you've ever seen any of these old-timey cartoons where, like, the Roadrunner. Have you ever seen the Roadrunner before or heard it? You know how the Roadrunner goes really fast and he runs over a cliff and he just keeps going straight across, and Wile E. Coyote runs out and he's about halfway out there, and then he's like, and he looks down and he goes like that. You ever see that? That's Peter. Peter gets out of the boat. He's walking towards Jesus, and at some point he's like, this is not possible. And as soon as that thought hits him, boom, down he goes. And he's like, help me, Jesus. And Jesus picks him up and walks him back to the boat, and it's like, not again. Peter. That's sort of how he is. So yeah, it's power.
And believe?
And yeah, the word I'm going to use is almost like that. I'm going to say trust. So we've got life, and we have death as big themes in with all the water, right? And then we have celebration, compassion, power, and trust also as sub-themes, as it were. But if you think about what baptism is, life and death are huge. They are major parts of what baptism is. Because what are we doing with baptism? Hmm.
Starting a new life in the church.
But before you can start a new life,
You have to die.
you have to die. Literal, well, not in the physical sense. But baptism means ending one way of life and starting a new one. It means literally saying, I can't do both of these things at the same time. I'm letting go of that. I have to go do this. And for baptism, it means I'm going to live a life where I am following Jesus. And if I'm following Jesus, I can't follow others. So those things die. In the old church, and that in the early first couple of hundred years of the church, the way they did baptism was completely different. They would have these big, what they call a baptistry in the back of the church, and they had stairs down one side and down the other side, right? And they usually did baptism at midnight because it was a powerful time. And often they would only do it at Easter. We have 4 main times, and we'll get to that in a minute. But they would do it at Easter, at midnight, and here's the catch. The person who got baptized would take off every stitch of clothing they had, and those clothes would be burned. They go into the water naked, and they would be baptized in the water, and then they would step out the other side and be clothed in a white robe. That's how baptism was. And the symbolism is the life before Christ is gone. Now you have a new life. And it's just, it's like a lot of things in life. You have to let go of things in order to do something else. You know, when people get married, your life changes dramatically, and it's never going to be the same again. No matter what happens after this, it will never be the same again. And you have kids, if you have kids, that's a really dramatic change in the way you live your life. And from that moment on, things will never be the same again. When we got a dog, oh my gosh. I don't know if you guys have any animals or anything. You get a dog, that is a pain in the, it's, your life changes. You got to get up every morning and walk the dog, and you got to clean up, and then you got to go do this 5 times a day, and you got to feed the dog, and you got to take him to the vet, and you got to get him, give him baths and stuff like that. And it never stops. And if you go away, you got to go find somebody to take care of them, or figure out how you're going to take them with you. All these things change the way you live. And the water is a sign of changing the way you live. But it's also a sign that this is going to be good. There's celebration involved in this. And it's a sign of the life we live is one of compassion, but also one with power because we trust. So that's all important stuff. That's the outward sign of baptism is water. Never forget that one. I'm just going to go on for a second and do I want you to open up your prayer books. All right? And what I'm interested in here is on page 302 and 303. You guys all right? And I'm actually going to have you guys let's see. Well, we'll break down into groups of 2, and Andy, you and I can talk. But so, Braden and Jalen, Bill and Grace, I'm going to have you guys work as teams, and I'm going to have you discuss things. So, and Andy, you and I can talk. Is that okay with you?
That'll do.
Okay. So you're gonna have, Braden, you're gonna have to move to Jalen. Jalen's not gonna move. Bill, you have to move over here. Actually,
Actually, I'll just go
I can-
yeah.
You guys just switch seats.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah.
No, we'll
Get
just
closer
sit
to him
back
because you're going to talk softly, and we'll go. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to look at the examination, which is on page 302. You see that? There are these questions that are going to be answered, right in the middle of the page. This is what happens at baptism. The priest will say, "Do you renounce Satan and all the spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God?" And people say, "I renounce them." But what I want you to do is to talk amongst yourselves for a couple of minutes about what that means. Who is Satan? Well, first of all, does anybody know what the word renounce means? What does the word renounce mean?
Despise?
Huh?
Despise?
Give up.
Oh, give up?
I didn't hear what you said.
I said despise.
Well, renouncing something you give it up because I'll say because you despise it, because it is not what you want. It's not good for you. It's not a good thing. You renounce violence, for example, right? Which means I'm not going to use violence because violence is a bad thing. You renounce, I don't know, sometimes when you take citizenship of this country, you have to renounce citizenship of your old country. Say, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to be part of that anymore, right? So, renouncing, there's 3 renounces in here. Do you renounce Satan and all the spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God? Do you renounce the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God? And do you renounce all sinful desires that draw you from the love of God? First question I really want you to get at is, who is Satan? If you hear the word Satan, what does that mean? Next question is, when it says the spiritual forces of wickedness, what does that mean? What is a spiritual force of wickedness? Okay? That rebels against God. Okay? So I want you to do those. And then I want you to get to the next question, which is, do you renounce the evil powers of this world which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God? And here I want you to really focus on in what ways do forces corrupt and destroy the creatures of God. And which creatures of God are we talking about? Okay? And what are the forces of evil? Or the evil powers, I'm sorry. And then the third one is, what sinful desires affect you? Okay? Give it 5 minutes. Andy, I'm going to grab a chair and we can go sit over here.
Okay.
Excuse me a second. I'm just going to grab a chair. And go. Shaitan. Don't mess with Shaitan. All right. So
Imagine being a kid. What's your name?
It was not the same thing. But what is the
Creatures of God, all things that, all things.
Don't say it. Only because it's just like,
It's the easiest thing to say.
but it doesn't mean anything. Well, then I'd have to say, well, what's the devil? What's he saying? Okay, well, it's Satan. No, you know, you just go back and forth. What is it? What's
Because the sinful desires of wanting something, everything else has, like,
there is a passage that sort of could lead an artist to assume that, but it's not the primary thing. First mention is, and actually it's not even Satan, it's the serpent. No mention of it being Satan or anything, but we assign that to Satan in Genesis, in the Adam and Eve story.
Mhm.
It never actually says that. Mm.
I've always just assumed
Hmm?
the evil
Yeah.
wants to draw, takes the light and there's like that
It's the toy.
like you take pictures,
Well, in Job, they do have a bet. They literally make a bet
overdraw.
over Job. Yeah, it's like, well, he's not that far off. Playing violin. No. And then, but it adds also, and spiritual forces of wickedness. How would you describe that? Are you guys talking?
Yeah.
Are you guys discussing these things? You got 2 minutes left, so, because I'm going to ask what you came up with.
Spiritual forces of wickedness. Yeah. Spirit was like the ideas that Satan has, like his influences on people.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of people.
It's funny that he's spiritual force. When you hear that, immediately say it's a force of God.
Yeah.
What's this?
Jesus, the Spirit.
But there are negative spiritual forces too, yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if I've read the words before. When I thought of it,
Yeah,
Yeah.
tough one, huh?
yeah.
How about the evil powers of this world that corrupt and destroy the creatures of God?
So for the first one we have God's enemy. Second one we have
I think so.
Mm-hmm. You can also be really concrete at this one. Michigan.
like being against God and what he
Um,
More specifically, like it destroys the earth.
all right, guys, let's get back together, huh?
That's my grandmother's alarm.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna we'll come back and see if you came up with anything. Who's Satan?
Devil.
Hmm?
The devil.
Devil. I see. That's what everybody's gonna say. What else?
God's enemy.
God's enemy.
Bad man.
Hmm.
Bad man.
Bad men.
The idea of like bad,
Okay.
like the embodiment of
Bad.
bad in the world.
Okay.
Bad.
Anything else?
Bueno.
There's a the first time Satan appears in the Bible is not in the story of Adam and Eve, because that's never referred to as Satan. That's referred to as a serpent, and that's all. The first time Satan appears in the Bible is in the book of Job, and God and Satan are having a little conversation there. They're walking in a garden, and they're talking about this and that, and God says to Satan, "Hey, my guy Job, right? What a great guy he is." And Satan says, "Yeah, but that's only because he has everything he wants." if you take away all of his stuff, he's going to hate you. And God says, I'll take that bet. And they make a bet. And the bet is that Satan can do anything he wants to Job without hurting him. And that'll make Job turn on God. So Satan, Grace.
The leader of hell.
Leader of hell. Well, a lot of the images we get of Satan come from somewhere other than the Bible, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, the leader of hell, for example, but you will never find that in the Bible, interestingly. The angel falling from heaven, because you might find allusions to that in the Bible, but it's not really spelled out. That's actually in literature later on. There people write that. Paradise Lost, for example. A lot of people confuse that with the Bible. So for us, we're going to talk about Satan's function as much as anything. In the book of Job, Satan is given a job by God, and the job is to push Job to his breaking point and to see, basically he's doing quality control. Pushing him to his breaking point to see if he'll break or if he'll stay true to God. That's the whole function of Satan. Pushes people. Or another way of looking at it is, have you ever seen people chop wood? And sometimes they'll use a mallet instead of an axe, and they'll get the wood and they're going to split the wood. And then they'll use a wedge, and they'll stick the wedge in there, and then they'll whack that. And it splits the two parts apart, right? A lot of times Satan acts like that. Just gets in there and separates you from God. That's the whole point. Which is why people associate the serpent with Satan, and probably not a bad idea, because the serpent gets in there and starts to sow doubt. I don't know if you know how the story goes, but Adam and Eve, they're fine, they're happy and everything, right? And then Eve is alone. The serpent comes up to her and says, "How you doing?" And she says, "Oh, great, life is good." He says, "Oh, is it really? Huh? Yeah. Well, what can you do here?" And Eve says, "Well, I can eat any of the fruit here except for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." And the serpent says, "Well, gee, wonder why that is." And she goes, "Well, because God says I'll die." And the serpent says, "Really?" He says, "I got to tell you something. You won't die. The reason God doesn't want you to eat from the tree of the fruit of good and evil, or eat of the fruit of the tree of the good of evil, the knowledge of good and evil," that's a long word. Anyway, is because if you eat of this fruit, and just so you know, the Bible never says apple, ever once. But if you eat of this fruit, you're going to be just like God. As it is, you're not. You're not good enough. You are less than you could be. Have a nice day. And just puts this doubt in her, which is to say, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. Oh, and then the serpent comes back and says, "Oh, by the way, if you do eat the apple or the fruit, it's quite good, and you will be like God." Wouldn't that be nice? It almost sounds like a commercial on TV, right? Which is exactly what commercials on TV are modeled after. The serpent in Genesis. Isn't that nice? You will never look at another commercial the same again.
How it feels to chew 5 gum.
Huh?
How it feels to chew 5 gum.
Say that louder because I'm deaf.
How it feels to chew 5 gum.
Exactly. I remember a Mountain Dew commercial. You guys know Mountain Dew, right? Yeah. And the whole commercial was, you've got a guy with a snowboard strapped to his feet. He's in an airplane. He jumps out of the airplane without a parachute. He's sailing through the sky, and they're saying, this is a Mountain Dew guy, and he's doing just awesome things. He lands on the mountain, snowboards down the mountain, and makes a perfect stop right in front of the beautiful girl, or something like that, and says, do you want to be a Mountain Dew guy, or do you want to be a Coke guy? And you see a guy, a young guy with horn-rimmed glasses and a sweater like mine, sitting there playing chess. And he says, "What do you want to be, a Mountain Dew guy or a Coke guy?" And that's kind of what the serpent was doing in Genesis, which is to say, you're not good enough right now. That's the whole function of Satan in a lot of ways. With Job, he does all this terrible stuff to Job, and all of his friends say, what did you do to make God mad? Because if bad things happen to you, that's because you are bad. The whole point of that story is bad things just happen to good people. It's not because you're bad or did something wrong that bad things happen to you. Sometimes bad things just happen. But where people's minds were if bad things happen to you, you are at fault. So Satan's job was to make Job doubt himself. A commercial's job is to make you think you're not good enough. The serpent's job was to make Eve think she was not good enough, to sow doubt, because that means that you no longer believe that you're good enough, that God made you good enough. So part of Satan's job is to put that split between you and God, and whatever it takes. And it might be with fear, or doubt, or anger. Remember in the sermon we were talking about anger? It breaks relationships. Fear, if you ever see any of the angels showing up in Scripture, what's the first thing they say? Don't be afraid. Fear not. Don't be afraid. So fear and anger and doubt. Those are the things, and as well as simply an unwillingness to see, hiding your head in the sand. Those are things that separate us from the will of God. Those are the tools of Satan. Satan is that which separates you from God. And that means making you afraid, making you doubt, making you angry, making you hate. Because hate is, and contempt, those are the things that separate us from God. Not wanting to see the world before us. I don't know if you listened to the blessing at the end of the service, but it says, may your eyes be so blessed that they can see those in need around you, or something like that. So, there it is. Anyway, that's Satan to a degree. What are the spiritual forces of wickedness then? Because that's not Satan, so what are the spiritual forces of wickedness? What did you guys come up with? Did you say anything, Jalen?
The things that he does to make you want to rebel against God. It's not him himself, it's what he does.
Yeah. Sort of like sowing doubt or sowing fear. You see this a lot. I talk a lot about social media, but you see it a lot on social media. What I would consider the spiritual forces of wickedness that rebel against God are those things where you say, look at those bad people, they're scaring us. Look at them, they're not good. Anytime you see people raising fear or raising indignation against others, making you fear a whole group of people, making you think you're better than a whole group of people, or making you think that the other group of people are after you or after what you have, that's one of the spiritual forces of wickedness. You could put it under fear, greed. There was a movie a long time ago, and the only line I remember from the entire movie, you know what I'm going to say, don't you? What's the line?
Greed is good.
Greed is good.
Gordon.
Mm-hmm. And guess what? It's not good. Just saying. It's not good. It's very bad. Anger. But you go to some of these rallies. I used to study World War II. I studied. I got a fellowship to study Hitler for a year. To go to Germany and study Hitler for a year. The way he spoke in his rallies was to get people really, really angry at somebody. That's why they targeted the Jews, because you find a target. They would also make them feel very, very proud. Pride is another one of those spiritual forces, that because you've got to be better than other people, right? You've got to be on top. So these are some of those things that really get you. And then, of course, as I said, doubt. Those are all those things that are tools to split you apart from God and from each other, to be honest. So, Grace.
So are movies and TV shows, like for example Jojo Rabbit, does that have like anything to do with that? Like, is it like?
I've only read the reviews of Jojo Rabbit, so I can't say for sure.
Yeah.
I know
I
that
know
that's
it
a
has Hitler
satire.
in it.
What's that?
I know it has Hitler in it.
Yeah, it does have Hitler in it. There are a lot of movies with Hitler in them. Mel Brooks did one, the producers, and he does this whole thing about Hitler, right? So you can mock Hitler, but what you can't do, and I just don't know Jojo Rabbit, so I can't answer.
I don't know it either.
But I do want to see it because I think it's an important thing to get a sense of. But what I do know is I had a science teacher who was a teenager during the World War II. And there was a big rally. You guys know World War. You've studied World War II, right? Okay. So there's this big rally at the Olympic Stadium, and Joseph Goebbels, who was the big propaganda minister of the Nazis, he's doing this whole big speech, and then he gets them all, and they're all like screaming and shouting and everything, and he says, "Do you want total war?" Meaning to the death. And everybody's shouting, "Yes, yes, yes, yes," you know. And he's sort of engaged almost all of these senses going on here during that rally, big rally, right? And everybody's screaming. She said, "I was screaming and shouting, and and we were like, we were gonna go kill them all and everything, right?" And then the rally ends, and she's walking home. And she said, all of a sudden, all that stuff just hit her, what they had just done. And she said she just like burst into tears right then. She just like, it's like, we've just destroyed our whole country. We're all gonna die. She was 14 years old. She's like, we're all gonna die. How did we do this? It was like waking up from a nightmare in a way, only to wake up into another nightmare. All those things are used to get us to hate each other and to separate ourselves and to hate ourselves, quite frankly. Most people who hate other people kind of hate themselves too. So those are all spiritual forces. Let's look at something else. But these are important things. Remember, these are the things, by the way, we're renouncing, right? We renounce this stuff. Just want you to get that through. This is not good, right? What about renouncing the evils of the evil powers of this world, which corrupt and destroy the creatures of God? When it says corrupt and destroy, we're talking in a very real sense. So think concretely. Think of something that's real that can be corrupted or destroyed. Give me one thing that can be corrupted and destroyed.
Animals.
Say it loudly.
Animals.
Animals, yeah.
People.
People, yeah. In what way can they be destroyed or corrupted?
On the inside.
Hmm?
People corrupt themselves.
Corrupt what?
Corrupt themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Others and themselves. What else can be corrupted and destroyed?
The environment.
The environment. Look at the wording of that for just a moment. See how it says destroys the creatures of God? What are the creatures of God? Aside from animals and people?
Everything.
Everything. We believe God made everything. And therefore, everything has to be cared for. The world is God's. We're responsible for at least not screwing it up. Right? Jim?
Then is the devil a creature of God?
The good question, and the answer is probably yeah. However, the way theology deals with this is by saying that relationship has to be voluntary. You can't have a good relationship that's not that's forced. Therefore, you cannot force somebody to have a relationship with God. And how there's the split between God and Satan, that's a good question. It could simply be, one of the traditional stories is because Satan was given the job of pushing, Satan began to feel that Satan had power. As opposed to doing a job for somebody, it was Satan had the power of all these people and began to believe his own propaganda, as it were. You know, I don't know for sure, nor do I know exactly how much that is an actual being versus the way we're made. I do know that we are complex beings. We just are. We're made complex. And I do know that when God creates, it's to be in relationship. And in whatever way that a relationship is, I was going to say impeded, but you know, when something gets in between that relationship, that's bad. It's bad for us, kind of kills the soul. And it's usually through either fear, anger, doubt, greed, or pride. I'm sure we can think of other things too. A certain amount of arrogance, that's part of pride. So, yeah, perhaps Satan is. I mean, this is one of those questions people have been arguing about for thousands of years, so we're not going to solve it. But we can be fairly certain that yes, whatever it is that gets between us and God is an evil power. Let me throw out some things real quickly that do corrupt and destroy these creatures of God, and maybe you can think of others. Is that fair? Pollution? Okay. Name something else that can corrupt and destroy. Money. What else? Everybody think of something.
Pain.
Pain. And what would have caused that pain?
Death.
Well, I'm hoping after death there is no pain. Just saying.
No, like the death of someone else.
Oh, so emotional pain.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll come back to that one in a minute. I want to think about that. Okay, let's go on.
Mental illness.
Okay. Now let's just rephrase. Let's take a look at this. The evil powers that corrupt and destroy the creatures of God. And yes, mental illness can, but we're going to put that here too. Let's think of more active, somebody causing it in something else.
Terrorism.
Okay. Anything else? Hate. Again, let's be as concrete as we can. You want me to be? Here, I'll go. What do you think? Can that destroy the creatures of God? All right. It says guns. What else?
Politics.
Politics can. Mm-hmm. Especially if it's sort of toxic politics. Politics is also people deciding how to treat each other. So it can go, just like emotional pain, some of these things are part of who we are. And they don't have to corrupt and pollute, or corrupt and destroy. But yeah, we'll put that here.
What about drugs?
And when I say drugs, I do not mean the kind that are designed to help you heal. But there are drugs that can harm you. And you should probably put alcohol here too. Because that can also be harmful. We have to be careful with that because Jesus did turn water into wine. However, a lot of things have both a sort of a positive and a negative to them, right? Pollution has almost no positives to it. Terrorism has almost no positives to it. Hate and use of guns against others has there's not really much in the way of positives to it. Anything else? That'll be our start then. These are things that we use. Bullying would be a tool against harming another and corrupting and destroying creatures. I mean, I've seen kids commit suicide because of bullying. That's pretty destroyed, right? I have seen, well, if you look at our environment, it's kind of trashed right now. You guys are in the middle of experiencing a reduction in air quality for the first time in 50 years. You're welcome. Yeah. You're experiencing a reduction in water quality for the first time in about 50 years. There used to be a time when the Hudson River was so bad that you couldn't even go in the river. There was a time when the Lake Erie was so bad it caught on fire. The lake caught on fire. It was so polluted. When you would go down to the river, you'd see garbage just floating down. It used to be really, really bad. You used to not be able to see the skyline of Manhattan because it was so smoggy, just so much smoke and smog and dirt and grime in the air. They worked really hard to clean it up. Pollution is a bad idea. The water in Flint, Michigan. Do you know what they put in that? I mean, you know why that's so bad? Do you know about the water in Flint, Michigan?
Yeah.
We can't drink it. It's like
Why?
the same thing that just happened over in Dupaltsville past week.
It has lead in it. It has a lot of lead in it. And it was actually a government decision to switch water supplies from one that was safe to one that was not. And why? Because they made money. People were getting rich off it. So yeah, I mean, money comes in there again, right? So these are the things we are saying are bad because they hurt people, they kill animals, they destroy the environment. Your goal, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, is to not hurt stuff. Not to not harm people, but in fact, to do the opposite. Racism. Xenophobia. You know xenophobia? Yeah?
Fear of foreigners.
Fear of foreigners.
Prejudice.
Say again?
Prejudice.
Prejudice, yes. Anti-LGBTQ. Those are all things that harm others. Right? Sexism. I mean, this year is the 100th anniversary of of women gaining the right to vote, right? Before that, they didn't. If you look at some of the old commercials, and I've watched old commercials and I study them and they're kind of fun for me. The way in the 60s commercials treated women it's just outrageous, you know? The woman's job is to treat the man well, to take care of your husband when he gets home, it's just incredible. That's sexism, right? I didn't write it down. All those things are bad. And those are the things we renounce. All right? So if we have all this renouncing, then what are you turning to? Remember, renouncing something means you're saying no to one thing so you can say yes to something else, right? Good. Well, now you get your prayer books open again, right? So let's go. What do I want to look at? I just want to do one other thing real quick. There are two different things I want to look at, kind of. The first one is where it says, do you turn to Jesus Christ and accept him as your Savior? Okay, who's Jesus? And you're going to have to shout it out really loud because I'm getting deafer and deafer as I go. So, who's Jesus?
Son of God.
Son of God. What does that mean? Just shout it out.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, so what? So what if he's the Son of God? Who cares? What does that mean for you?
Came to save
Ah.
save us our sins away.
Yeah, because what's it say? It says, do you turn to Jesus Christ and accept him as your Savior? Wait a minute. Okay, so saving from what? Huh? Sin? Which is what? What is sin? Again, it's separation from God, separation from each other, broken relationship. That's what sin is, right? That's all this stuff which harms ourselves and others. That's what sin is. Harming others, turning other people into objects, turning the environment into objects as opposed to that which is important. Everything has, as it were, spirit. And Native American cultures, everything has a spirit. And quite frankly, they're probably right. So, it's all important, right? Sin is the separation from God and each other. That thing, Satan being the wedge that separates us, sin being the separation. More than anything else, that's what that is. So, if Jesus is saving us from sin, from separation, the question is how? What is he doing to separate us? And I'll just tell a quick little story. If you look at the Old Testament, one of the things it tells us is that people are screwed up. But it also tells us that over time, people got strange ideas about God and sort of internalized them. When Abraham had the first relationship with God, all God said to Abraham was, you be my guy, and I'll be your God, and I will bless you so that you can bless others. The whole idea is to have this relationship so that he can also be a blessing to other people. Boom, done. That's it. Then it develops into this whole big thing where God is this guy up in the sky who's angry at them all the time, and they got to appease God somehow, and so they have all these sacrifices and all this sort of stuff. And in the end, what happened was that people got afraid of God, which is weird if God is love. That's just fear really isn't even a factor there, shouldn't be. They got afraid of God, and they thought all they had to do was do the right things and God wouldn't get them. That's a bad relationship. That's not a good relationship, and it's a relationship that basically kills you inside. It creates fear, anger, doubt, greed, and pride when you at least get part of it right. And so people just didn't love God. They feared God. And we talk about putting the fear of God into people. We still talk about that to this day. And God's like, I don't want that. I don't want people to hate me. I don't want people, it's like, I really, that's not what I'm about. I'm about just being in a loving relationship, and ideally them being in loving relationships with other people. That's what I'm looking for. But they're afraid of him, so how do you get somebody to understand that you love them? As a parent. And God's solution is to become one of us. Right? So, Jesus is born as one of us, lives as one of us, teaches us, right? And then does one thing that nobody who is self-centered, greedy, hateful would do. And that is dies for you. Now we talk about, you may notice that in the Gospels, Jesus starts to talk about God as a father. That's almost not done at all in the Old Testament. God there is talked about as Lord and King, maybe as a shepherd, but not as a father, not as a parent. And Jesus uses language both as mother and father for God, right? So we can too. And the whole change in the relationship is one from being afraid to one of being in intimate love, to that kind of love of somebody who that you can absolutely trust, and you can absolutely open up to, and you can absolutely know that they will always be there. That's the relationship. And Jesus shows that by doing what a self-centered person would never do, which is to offer his life for you. Having said that, then he rises again to life, in part to show that it's real, that it's not just a nice guy who dies, but rather it's God doing it. Because if Jesus had just died and not risen, then all people would say was, well, he was a really nice guy, but boy, it was a very sad death he went through. But when you have the resurrection, then you sit there and say, no, God was doing something here. And what God's doing is, again, showing us that we're not, that this isn't part of who we were called to be. But we're called to be part of life and love and caring for each other. That's what we're there for. So that's the salvation part. That's what we're saved from. And that's why the very next question is that word trust again. Do you put your whole trust in his grace and love? And he was like, oh, trust, yeah. We trust. And then the next question is, do you promise to obey him, to follow and obey him? We're always talking about following Christ. Because if you are connected, if you spend your time connecting with God, you will see where God is leading. And it can lead you to places you did not anticipate. The old joke that I tell is I've been here a long time now, but I wasn't looking to come here. The reason I came to St. James was because the church that I was working in ran out of money, and so I was working at getting them back on their feet financially, but my bishop had said, listen, maybe this church never really could support somebody, so I want you to also look around. And I was looking around in North Carolina because that's where I was working. But one day, this envelope shows up from St. James in Hyde Park, and I threw it in the garbage. And the next day it was on my desk again. And I threw it in the garbage. And the next day it was on my desk again. And I'm thinking, what is that all about? And I turned to my wife and said, Liz, do you know anything about this? And she said, well, why don't you just go look into it? And I came up to Hyde Park to visit. I actually had to come up to New York for another thing anyway. I came up and I looked at it and I said, nope, not me. Don't want to go here. And So I didn't. But then they called me and they said, "Can we just have an interview?" And I said, "Yeah, fine." And I was snotty. I was a snotty guy. I was not very pleasant. And I don't know why they still kept calling. But finally, some of them came down to meet me, and then my wife says, "You gotta come. You just gotta go up to New York." And so we go up to New York, and it's like, I don't want to be here. I want to go. I'm going back to North Carolina. And I get into a meeting with the people in the vestry, and if you ever want to have an example or of God sitting there saying, "I want you to come here, and I want you to listen, and I want you to follow me," this was it. And in the middle of this meeting, which was supposed to be 1 hour, 3 hours later, we're still meeting. But now, instead of me saying, "Thank you very much, have a nice life, I'm going back to North Carolina," instead of that, we're huddled over all these plans of things we were now going to go do. And I just turned to Liz and I said, "We're coming here." And she said, "Yeah, I know." So that's God leading and finally figuring out maybe I ought to follow. And it worked. It's been a pretty good time so far. Sometimes you have to let go of yourself a little bit to follow. And when you do, it works out pretty darn good. Okay, hold on. I just have to do that. Anyway, that's that. So we're following Jesus. And the way to follow is to read scriptures, of course, because if you follow them, Jesus will pay attention and will take you to places. And I'm running out of time, so I want to look at on page 304. Down at the bottom here, not the baptismal covenant part here, that's sort of basically the creed, just in a question and answer form. But down, sorry, I keep getting these texts all of a sudden. Anyway, down here where it says, this is questions that you guys will answer, by the way. This is going to be something very similar to what you'll be doing at the confirmation, because confirmation and baptism are close together, right? But it says, will you continue in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers? Do you know what the apostles' teaching and fellowship is? It's like, how am I going to say yes to that if I don't know what it is?
That just going to church? Like going to...
That's part of it, yeah. The apostles' teaching, of course, is found where first?
Bible?
In the Bible, right. That means you're committing to studying. It's like, oh man. But it can be pretty rich. Fellowship, you're right, going to church. Where are you going to get fellowship? And we're talking fellowship in Christ. Mostly is in church. And you know why? You know why the fellowship part is important? Because relationships require being present. You can't have a relationship where you're not really present. Yes, you can have Facebook friends, you can have Twitter followers, you can do stuff in Instagram and Snapchat, and I can't remember what the newest TikTok. I don't know what the newest ones are. You can do that, but they only make sense if you actually have a real relationship too. You know, one of the dumbest things Facebook has done is have friends that you've never met before. Yes, there is a form of relationship with people, even in a correspondence kind of a way. But that's not a substitute for real human interaction. You know, it's better than nothing, but it's not a lot better than nothing. People need people to be together, right? You got to be together with people. Families, our family always ate dinner together. The boys sometimes had to sort of work around things, but we always ate dinner together because being physically present matters. One of my favorite moments was, and for our family, Friday night is always pizza night. You know, it just is. Friday night's pizza night. And what I really loved was when the boys went off to college, they ended up going to the same college, And we called one of them once on a Friday night, and he says, sorry, we called Nick, and he says, I can't talk to you now. I'm meeting Chris. We're going out for pizza. And I said, you're going out with your little brother for pizza? And he says, it's Friday. Of course. I thought, felt so good there. You know, it's like our boys, they're still doing it. They felt that being together was important. And I thought that was one of my sort of big parent moments. You know, it's like, yeah, you get it. Being together is important. And those boys don't get along all the time, but boy, do they stick around and walk together. You know, even to this day, every now and then one of them will call and say, oh, you know, it's like he's just not getting it. Yeah, he's kind of bossy, you know, stuff like that. But boy, they do so much together, even though they live 3 hours away from each other. Now they do, because they've all graduated college and have jobs and stuff. But they still do stuff together. They're getting together next weekend. It's awesome. So fellowship is important. Will you persevere in resisting evil, and whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord? Resisting evil. In this case, it's talking about for yourself. Resist fear. Don't be afraid. When people try to make you afraid, don't let them. When people try to goad you into being angry, let go of that. When people make you doubt yourself, you sit there and say, no, I am absolutely of great value. Because you are. When people try to make you think that, you know, having more stuff is going to make you better, you can just say, no, you know, that really doesn't make anybody any happier, because there are a lot of rich people who are miserable wretches. There are a lot of poor people who are miserable wretches too. Money isn't the thing that's going to make you rich or poor, but lack of money isn't going to make you richer, isn't going to make you happy or angry either. That's going to come from somewhere else. And arrogance or pride or condescension, you condescending other, that is what we're avoiding. That's what we're resisting. And we fall into it all the time, so we just return. Repenting, the word repent, it just means turn around. That's all it means. You're going the wrong way, turn around. That's it. That's all the word means. These next 3 questions I want to get to because the last one's really important for me. But we'll go through them real quickly. Will you proclaim by word and example the good news of God in Christ? The good news is God loves you. That's the good news. The good news is nothing can separate you from the love of God. You can't make God stop loving you. That's the good news. So the question is, will you some way, shape, or form make that known in your life? And if so, how? And it might be just being open to listening when people ask questions. You know, I got to college and I wasn't particularly, I was studying journalism in German. I wasn't really doing anything, but somebody came up and said, you're kind of religious, aren't you? And I was like, why? Where is this going? And some other person had this really deep and important question that they wanted to just hash out with somebody. That's how that happens. You make yourself open to listening to other people. Then, here's the important one, or the second, the most important one for me. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons? Seek and serve Christ in all persons. That means actively looking to see what God loves in other people. And that is so hard these days. I don't know, for me it is at least. And it's an act of will to look at somebody who has such entirely different values from me and to see what God loves. I have to really, really work at that sometimes. But I don't have a choice not to, do I? Because I said I was going to do that. And I will do it. It ain't easy. There are people I sit there and say, I don't see how God can possibly. And yet, I just don't. I don't get it sometimes. But God says, so keep looking. Just keep looking. Eventually, you'll look your eyesight will get better. I don't know. But yeah, serving Christ in everyone. As somebody said, when Jesus healed people, he never asked them if they could pay for it. He never asked them if they deserved it. He just said, "What do you need?" And they said, "I want to be healed." He said, "Okay." That's it. Jesus didn't ask if you were good enough. He just did. And the last one that I want to look at, everybody just read this last one out loud. You can also grab your book. Okay, read it out loud together. Will
You strive for justice and peace among all people, and respect the dignity of every human being.
Okay. The things that you're called to do in these is to always respect the dignity of every person. It is to seek to strive for. Do you know what the word strive means? It's not just saying, "Hey, justice would be nice." It means to work for justice and for peace. Those two things go hand in hand. That's what your job is. You don't get a choice in saying, "I don't want to do that." Well, God's going to keep pestering you and say, No. I really am looking for you to be part of this. Not to be sitting on the sidelines. Not to say, "Oh, let somebody else deal with that." The whole point of following Jesus is that Jesus takes you to places that are not easy places to be. And Jesus takes you to people who are not necessarily easy people to be with. And Jesus says, "Open your eyes and look and see what I see. And see someone who is worthy of your love. And when they are abused, you are abused. And when they are afraid, you're the agent I'm sending to help them not be afraid." That's it. And this is a country that is built on a lot of abuse and fear and anger. We came in and we sort of destroyed the homes of the Native Americans. We brought people from Africa and other countries, or other continents even, and treated them as slaves. The Chinese came here, and the first laws we had for immigration laws were designed so that the Chinese wouldn't be able to participate in society. That's our first immigration laws in 1882. Were designed to make sure that the Chinese couldn't be here. And if they got here, they couldn't have any part in society. There's a lot of hatred and condescension and arrogance and pride and greed and fear and anger and doubt in our country. And there has been for a very long time. And God knows that, and God says, "Well, guess what? This is the setting you have to work in. Everybody has their own setting, and this is yours." Mine too, and yours too. We're all stuck with it. But the opportunity, the good side is, that means you're never going to be bored. If you're following Jesus, you will always have work to do. Because there's, how many people in the world now?
7 billion? More?
That's a lot of people. 7 billion people is a bunch. Every single one of them is God's, right? And 90% of them live in poverty you can't imagine. That's sort of staggering when you think about 6 billion of the people of the world are living on like $1 a day. That's kind of frightening, and maybe that's an exaggerated number, but it's a large percentage, are living very poor lives. So there's a lot of work in this world. I don't know what it'll all look like. But if we start here at home, we know that in our country, there's a lot of fear, a lot of anger, a lot of pollution, a lot of, I don't know, dissension. But there's also a lot of joy, a lot of celebration, a lot of fun. And those all go hand in hand, by the way. We call church a celebration of the Eucharist. That's the place where you get to come in and sort of step away from everything and just be. You know, so it's a back and forth. But baptism, the vows, these promises we make at baptism, that is where everything begins. That's the starting point. And the starting point for us is getting some water on our heads, often when we're babies. However, the last baptism I did was an adult, maybe the second to last one I did, 32-year-old. And that was pretty powerful. She said, you know, it's like, this is like life-changing for me. It's a whole big deal. Moving into a new life that is better, more complicated. But every time you start something new, it's more complicated. You get into a relationship, it's more complicated, but it's better. Get kids, more complicated, and maybe not better for everybody, but in a good parenting family, it's better. You know, I'll speak for myself. Having kids was not easy, but it was better. You know, all those things are complicated because you're always working, but it's better. Anyway, that's where it starts. It starts with baptism. Okay, I'm done. Any questions? Any thoughts? So when the bishop comes, you'll see baptisms. You're scratching your head.
Hmm? I had an itch.
Oh, okay.
No.
I thought I
That
said
was not a
something that was-
commentary.
Yeah, you can't tell sometimes, you know. All right, gang. I know this one went long. Baptism always goes long.